You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. And I have Raymond McCauley, chair at Singularity University of Digital Biology, the co-founder and chief architect for BioCurious, a hackerspace for Biotech. So Raymond, thanks for coming. How you doing today?
Really good. Thanks for having me, Rich.
Yeah, I've interviewed a bunch of Singularity U faculty, and they have at least two major things going on. So what's a little bit about your background? Like what are you working on with Singularity and then outside of Singularity?
And it's kind of fun. One of the big lessons that I've personally learned from Singularity is to no longer work on one thing at a time. And that really suits me. So I actually started out professionally as a computer scientist and working on, web enabling databases and stuff in the 90s. And then I had a long time interest in genetics and in nanotechnology, and I went back to school to become a biophysicist. And, that's a pretty big shift right there. And then ended on adding on molecular biology and some other things, and really pursued sort of a second life as a biologist. And that's sort of really carried over into my work life. So I no longer really have one job or even, any one real job. I do a lot of different things. I work for Singularity University, where we advise everything from startups and Fortune 500 companies all the way to governments. We work on doing a lot of business education. I do a lot of consulting out in the world, and I do more and more things where I'm basically just working with these companies that are at the frontiers of biotechnology and trying to help them solve practical problems, make associations with folks who can help them out, and also helping investors find the right companies that'll improve their portfolios. So yeah, the hardest question I always answer is, what do you do? And I used to be able to say, I'm a scientist, but now it's like, well, I do a whole bunch of things, where do you want to come at it from?
Well, since you work on multiple things, I don't know, is it a trade-off in terms of focus? Like, how do you work on multiple things without, being a jack of all trades and master of none?
The multitasking, doesn't work. And I think sometimes the answer is, how do you work on a lot of things like that? It's like poorly is the real answer. But it's nice. I think more and more jobs in society are becoming organized. And, people talk about the gig economy. I think I like better looking at it as project-based. And so it's the kind of thing my exemplar for this is Hollywood and how Hollywood works. Nobody gets a 30-year lifetime career working on Avatar. They, work on things a project at a time. And then whenever they're ready to do something else, whenever something wraps up, they switch to the next thing. You work with people that you've known well from other projects who are able to get things done. Those are the ones that you bring with you on the next project. Those are the ones who bring you onto things. And so I kind of see that, instead of working for one company for a long time at a time, I think we're all sort of switching around, and it's changed the way we communicate. It's changed the way we're sort of inhabiting the future. It's starting to change the way we're educating the next couple of waves of the workforce, although people are still kind of stuck in that old paradigm. But yeah, my big challenge is, how can I keep a bunch of disks spinning and still make meaningful progress on some given project if I've got 10 or 12 up in the air. And I found, like, if I've got 20 going,
chiropractic.
If I've got 20 going, I can't do it. But if I've got 10 going, I can do pretty well. If I focus down to 3, and sometimes that's what I do, is I have to put a lot of things off. I say, we're clearing this week and I'm only working on these things until it gets done.
Oh, that makes sense. If you were to go back and rework your education, what would you do differently to now that you know what's going on, now that you have this model, this paradigm that you're working in, like, how would you change your education, or for other people that want to do what you do?
That's kind of one of my favorite questions and one of my favorite things to examine and sort of try to enact. And part of that is because I've got 12-year-old twin boys. So I kind of look at them as going through the singularity and, maybe puberty at about the same time. And they're going to be really literally graduating out into this new world. I spent a huge amount of time trying to be somebody who was a polymath, like pursuing a lot of things and doing it through traditional education, picking up additional degrees. And if I had it to do over, I would go ahead. I like the idea of having like a good, firm analytical base as an engineer, and then spending less than a year at a time adding on a new field. One of my favorite things to do, and a piece of advice I give, is when somebody's like, hey, here's this new thing I want to study that's totally different, where should I go to school or how should I do that? I'm like, don't enroll in a degree plan, start a company. And, when you start a company, you end up applying yourself so assiduously to picking up new material and read some books for sure. But even better than that sometimes is, like, what you really want is to have a best friend who's really good at something that you can both ask a bunch of dumb questions of and get them to sort of lead you to the edges of the field so you understand what it's capable of and what it's not. And also be the person who's on your speed dial that you can just call up and say, listen, this thing came up. Am I looking at it right? Do I understand it? What's the next best thing? Who's the next best person to talk to about this? And so I think we're sort of replacing or at least augmenting. We still need, really deep experts in particular deep technical fields, in deep historical fields, just people who actually have institutional memory. But we're augmenting that by sort of webbing all of this together with people who understand enough about each one of these things to be dangerous. And so if you're not driven to be a deep expert, then be a wide expert and understand a lot of things and be that glue that hold people together. And I think sometimes, we call those people translators. And so I spend still a tremendous amount of my professional life translating, where sometimes I'm the guy where everybody thinks I know what I'm doing, but really I'm just willing to ask dumb questions. Or I'm the guy everybody thinks I know what I'm doing, and so they turn to me. And what I do is I just say, okay, so what our user interface person said was this, and am I repeating that back right? Do I have it? Okay, so that means this for a timeline, and it means this for whenever you guys in marketing are talking about this. What do you think? And having somebody who can translate those things. So being the translator, being the generalist, that helps out a lot.
So what kind of projects are you focused on and working on right now? What are the most interesting ones you have?
A couple of things that are kind of interesting and far out. I'm working with a group of folks around the world on a thing not quite ready for prime time, but we're trying to come up with a genetic engineering manifesto. So especially some of the human genetic engineering work that happened late last year that was revealed to the world. We've seen a lot of people who are sort of trying to, signal in the field that they are trying to do good and not evil. And therefore, we should put a moratorium on this until we've all had time to think about it. And we're coming back with sort of an alternative that probably the worst thing to do is just stand on the brakes and not do this sort of thing, but to say, hey, what are different frameworks that we could adopt for saying, here are things that should be easy and allowable. Here are things that are maybe treading on the edges of what people worry about and could start causing problems. And, should we?
What are some examples of either responsible or irresponsible genetic engineering that we've seen in the last year or so?
Well, I think a lot of people point fingers at what Dr. He Jiankui did in China, where they engineered at least the embryos of twin girls to remove the CCR5 protein or to disable it. And this confers some sort of an immunity to HIV, to strains of HIV that we know of. So, and there are different people who are having different problems with this. And just as an example, some people think that it may have helped out, but there's not a big reason to help out to provide immunity to HIV, that wasn't something that was medically necessary. That doesn't enhance the lives of, these young girls. There are other people who are just worried about any change that we make that permanently changes the human spectrum of abilities. And there are other people who are just like, well, yeah, we should make these changes, but who decides and why should we do it? But I think that that's actually a fairly middle of the road change. And people are just worried about, some people are worried because it happened in China, and China has a different approach to bioethics and to regulatory issues. They're always kind of cast as the bad guys in the genetic engineering wars or the CRISPR stakes, people who are using the CRISPR technology. The thing I think that really is a bigger deal is, and again goes out to the real bad guy end of the spectrum, whenever we have people starting to make changes in the environment that have a possibility of not just affecting them personally or some small area, but affecting the rest of the world. And, it seems like then we really should require some sort of inspection. We should require some sort of approval because, here's one person taking a risk for their gain to do something they want to do, where all of us could end up being some version of loser, right? And so that's an issue.
Did he do it for just proof of concept, or did he do it? I mean, he didn't do it specifically to protect him from HIV because he was worried about that. He did it more for proof of concept, I would think. Yeah,
that seems to be the case, and it's been kind of hard to find out actually, what he technically did in the lab, and a lot about what his intentions were. Although he published a couple of videos the day that they announced this, and it did seem to be sort of, like, hey, here's a big step forward. We can do this now. How should we do this? But that got drowned out pretty fast. And some of it got drowned out, frankly, I think, by scientists who were trying to do, this signaling about how good and moral we are, and please don't make our research illegal, which I think was a little bit of a tone-deaf approach. People were coming in and worrying more about disapproval. And so they were kind of saying, no, we'll build a fence around this ourselves. And it just seems to be a poor way to do it. Well, one of the things, and I hold this as a truism, if you start taking a technology and building big fences around it, making something illegal or unfundable, undoable in certain regimes and certain regulatory places in certain countries, then what happens is you've left it open to all the countries you don't want to be working on this, all the places that are sort of the sinkholes of regulatory affairs. And that's not who we want in control of these powerful technologies.
So what do you need? A global conference and agreement and set of standards on genetic engineering? Is that what you're thinking?
Well, trying to come up with, one version of that would be fairly open and fairly workable, that wouldn't hinder real progress, but it would also.
Is there? Mm-hmm. Is there even? I didn't realize. Are there world congresses on this yet? Is there dialogue between nations and governments on this, or is it not at that stage yet?
Yeah, really not at that stage. So traditional government doesn't do well in regulating any kind of high tech. And the model that we've really had, actually, for a lot of high tech and that we've adopted for everything from machine learning and artificial intelligence up to, war robots and privacy and being able to distinguish things with social networks and sensors and what goes on there. But all the way back to genetic engineering was actually established for genetic engineering back in the 70s. There was a conference of scientists, the Assimilar conference, where people who had been working on recombinant DNA said, we're getting into spooky territory. And people were saying, let's call an absolute halt. And other people were like, no, it's not that big a deal. 1 in a billion chance that this goes wrong. And other people were like, no, that's high stakes. And they all got together and spent an intense sort of 2 or 3 days talking about possibilities and what practical curbs there could be on this. But it's a great example because it sort of forged the path forward to say, here is a workable way where we can, the people who know the most about this and have the biggest idea on what could happen in both the good and bad sense can go ahead and put out some sort of framework for controlling it, for saying here would be appropriate steps forward. If that makes sense?
Well, have you thought about organizing a international congress on this to get the dialogue going? Because you and let's say in the U.S. could sit here and talk to the right players and come up with a framework, but Europe may say, well, that's your framework, that's not our framework. And other countries may say, hey, we have our own framework, we don't even need to. So it just seems like this needs to be something that's global and has at least very early input from a lot of nations.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're actually getting global participants in this, but we're also working without a budget and kind of without a net. So we haven't talked about. I think like convening a big debating society would be tough. There are people who are talking about some of this online, but a lot of those discussions tend to get taken over with the worst hypothetical scenarios, which is not where you want to go. I think a huge part of this, though, is being able to take this and share it with like the lay scientific public, people who are interested in it, but don't necessarily have all the tools to practice it, right? And the idea there is instead of people kind of going towards the spookiest thing, it's like the spookiest thing is not the thing that worries us the most. The spookiest thing is, some weird hypothetical, but the thing that's maybe the most worrisome, those are the pieces that you want people to understand and look at. And the other thing that I think is super interesting about this is I don't think that we will come up with a universal and universally acceptable framework. I think that that's not only impossible, I think it's actually would be poorly guided to try to do that. We're going to come up with one way to do it and let other people react to it. And I think, and you brought up Europe, right? So looking at how for food, for GMOs, the US and Europe have these really diametrically opposing views, at least the lawmakers do, to go ahead and say, well, okay, that's fine. That's 2 experiments that we're now conducting globally. Here's the experiment on, the health of the population and the experiment of what's going on with the cost of agriculture and the ability to feed more people and a growing world population. Here are 2 different approaches. Which one is working out? And let's, we'll model it and try it and then actually enact it. And I think that we're going to see that same thing, especially with something that is even closer to our hearts than our food supply, which is what are our children going to be like? We're going to see different social groups and different groups that have different concerns, whether it's, disease in families or how do we pay for this or whatever is going on, are going to come up with different approaches to this. And that's fine. We ought to try a lot of different things and see what works. I'm just hoping we don't extinguish the flame of the new technology before it gets started or let it gutter out in, inappropriate places, which is the other thing that I worry about.
So, and what other projects are you working on in addition to this? I mean, this is like huge, sounds like. So what else is keeping you busy?
I've got a couple of things that are, close to a job that I do, where we're looking at the futures in longevity and what are some of the new technologies around that, and what does that look like? Looking at the futures of food and food production. And some of that is on GMOs and what goes on there, but a lot of that is actually centered around cellular agriculture, which I think is kind of making the biggest splash that we've seen in both the industry and the technology.
Cellular agriculture?
Oh yeah, this is my favorite piece of this technology. So there's this idea that we're now putting in practice that what would it be like if we could grow our food and especially our meat, but do the actual act of growing the meat outside of an animal. So instead of having to, take a little cute baby pig and feed it and, come up with the food and the water and the care and the appropriate use of antibiotics and get it up over a period of months and years to a point, where you slaughter it and then go ahead and throw away about 40% of it anyway and turn the rest into food and distribute that at some high price to the environment. What if, on the other hand, we could just take some cells from that pig and maybe from the pig where, we have known that line has produced the best tasting bacon ever, and grow those cells in a bioreactor, and then go ahead and once we have this large enough piece of meat, of tissue, harvest it and cook it without hurting the animal, without doing anything that would be bad for human health, and without the environmental cost of, raising the crops and everything by feeding it microbially, feeding it at a different scale. And so this has been a huge deal. We're actually seeing forms of this hit the consumer market now with Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat. These guys are doing plant-based proteins, sometimes with an extra component that is grown, what we always say, sort of in quotes, in the lab. It's really in a big production facility. And they're able to do this and make a meat that doesn't see the inside of an animal.
Yeah, I've spoken to a number of companies that are working on that, which is pretty cool. So far, a lot of them are just muscle burgers, but eventually there'll be a full complement of, very real type meats with marbling and fat and gristle and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, being able to do the real tissue organization and grow, a steak. But kind of on the easy end of that spectrum is being able to grow something that, looks like ground meat or acts like ground meat, tastes and has the mouthfeel and everything. And it's getting exponentially cheaper. So we had Mark Post, professor in the Netherlands, who actually has a company now to do this, to have that first $330,000 US hamburger that he did, I think, back in 2015. And now they are doing that for under $1,000. And they expect within the next couple of years to be able to do that for something near consumer prices. And we've got so many companies that are working on that exact thing right now. And some of them, I think, are actually within the next couple of years launching actual cellular ag products that will be, meat and look and feel like meat and cook like meat. And we'll be on this exponential sort of slope of getting cheaper and cheaper. So that's a huge deal. And it's a huge deal, not just because it's a new thing in the consumer market, which I think everybody, okay, here's a new kind of taco at Taco Bell, big deal. But it's a new way for us as a world-spanning population, right, to approach how we're doing protein production. And we've got more and more people, especially in China and in India, although people don't think about India as being a big meat-eating nation, it actually is, coming on board and getting into economic prosperity in a middle class where they're wanting to have, a diet like that, a Western-style diet with lots of meat. And so being able to feed those people up through the 2050s when we hit peak world population, huge deal. And can we do it?
How much additional load is anticipated based on everyone wanting to have a substantial amount of meat in their diet? What are the estimates?
It looks like it more than doubles the amount of protein and meat that we produce now. And that's significant. And, already I think the figure is production of meat is responsible for about the use of 40% of arable land. And so I don't think everybody's going to become a vegetarian, and I don't think we're going to cut down the rest of the rainforests to go ahead and make, farms to feed cows and pigs. And we sure shouldn't. So there ought to be a different way that we do it. And it's really interesting to kind of look at it as a global problem. It's a trade problem. It's a technical problem. It's an ecological problem. And so how do we come up with it? It's kind of funny. I think, we had this idea in the 20th century that we would end up with a world government, with a UN, either in a scary way or an enlightened way, because we need to stop the threat of nuclear weapons. I think that we may end up doing it in the 21st century just because we need to figure out a way for everybody to be able to eat a quarter pounder.
You said, with traditional meat production, consumption, that we're throwing away 40% of the animal, maybe more. Anyone that's looking at trying to not throw away 40% of the animal at least and use that existing, mass for food?
Yeah. There are a couple of interesting approaches to that. And if you kind of think about like naturally what happens, to an animal killed in the wild, or if you weren't processing these things, like if it was a small scale farm and here you had the inedible pieces of the carcass, it turns out there are either other animals that would eat it. And that sometimes gets us into trouble in our food supply. In fact, mad cow disease is something that really got to be a problem because people were feeding pieces of animals back into the food supply for animals that shouldn't be eating other animals. But if you look at it, we have insects that do this. So there's a couple of startup companies in Africa that are working on this problem of, hey, could we go ahead and take animal waste and feed it back into insects? And could we then use that insect as animal feed, or even that's a really incredibly efficient protein conversion. Could we use the insects themselves as protein? And, not everybody wants to have a grub taco. That's fine. But we could go ahead and process the protein into like a flour, or process it into some other kind of a food additive and get the same nutritional benefits that you would get from eating meat. And in fact, get it in such a way where you don't have some of the nutritional problems with eating meat. So some of that's a little avant-garde. Not, like I say, not everybody wants to add bugs to their diet, but it's this really neat way of looking at closing some of those loops where we're trying to dispose of the animals. And then one other thing that's kind of along those lines, if you look at like alternative proteins and other uses of things, people are like, well, we need to switch off of red meat anyway, or let's get away from fish, or let's get away from chicken and pork and beef and turn to fish. And it turns out that we actually, for about the last 20 years, have been right at the edge of capacity of wild fishing. And so different ways that we can do farmed fish, both on the land and actually in the sea, like, sea-going fish farms, have actually now surpassed the amount of tons of fish that we produce from naturally catching it, what we think of as a natural catch, fishermen going out on boats.
Is that deliberate because of the growth of the farms, or is it because also the availability of fish wild caught is falling?
We saw over the last 100 years, the number of fish that we were pulling out of the sea go up and up and up and up. And then in about the 80s and 90s, it kind of evened out and got jagged. In fact, it went up and down because we would overfish areas and crash the populations. And then we have seen now deliberately on this smooth, really exponential curve, the amount of fish out of fish farms has surpassed that and keeps going. And some of that's got its own problems. Are those fish as healthy as the kind of fish you would get versus wild caught? If we're raising them, to what extent are we, having the same kind of overcrowding problems and waste problems we would have with any other kind of farm? But it's interesting that there was just a paper out yesterday. It's kind of funny. So whenever we're seeing really high rates of evolution in fish that are caught out in the ocean, and people are like, what's going on with that? And what it is whenever you catch fish in the ocean, you basically try to keep the big ones and throw back the little ones because it's better economically to have big fish, and it's better for the fishing population to let the little ones grow up. Well, it turns out, Mother Nature kind of noticed this. And so the fish that are surviving are the smaller, slower growing ones. And so big fish populations in the ocean are now starting to show this trend of more fish that grow slower, which is a little harder for fishing them. But it's one of these unintended consequences that, technology and especially biology are so full of.
More fish that grow slower. Huh.
Well, and, if you eat all the fast growing fish,
you're taking out the breedable or the breeding adults of the fast growers. Is that why? So they just can produce less offspring?
Yeah. The big delicious animals are always the first ones to go extinct if you look at it that way. And now we're actually seeing that over even the last 20 years, but over the last probably 100 years in the oceans with good intentions. People were throwing back the little ones and keeping the big ones. And that didn't always mean they were throwing back the immature ones and keeping the post-mating adults. It just meant we were doing an artificial selection for, letting the small ones live. And so they're making more small ones.
What about a program where you're going after a certain species, I was say mackerel, and you're farming mackerel, and then every time you fish mackerel, wild caught, you throw in X number of farmed ones to try to make up for breedable adults or breeding adults back into that same area you fished them out of. You think that would work, or is that just kind of you would make a mess by doing that?
No, I think that's a worthy way to try to correct the imbalance. Other kinds of engineering, other kinds of, or honing that selection where you do select fish that are past, I don't know, do different fish have a breeding age? That's going further than my knowledge of fish reproduction stretches. So, but yeah, there ought to be ways to do this, but it's just, it was an interesting thing, which I think will affect how we eat in the future, right? And this was just published in the last week. And I thought it was interesting, it's something in a 5-minute conversation we can kind of come up with wow, oh, of course that would be how that would work. And why haven't we worried about that before? And now what do we do about it? This is the kind of thing that I love, and we were talking about projects that we're working on. This is the kind of thing I love bringing up in some of the classes that we do for kids. And kids just have, this natural ability to solve problems whenever they're not trying to color in the lines, whenever they're not trying to just do rote memorization or some of these other things. They really want to try things out. And so giving them a forum in which to say, here's a real problem, what would you do? And then maybe come up with, well, okay, let's do it. Could we raise some fish and see if it works that way? Or, could we make a computer model and see if that works? And just the trying to go hands-on in these different ways is incredibly educational, but entertaining. People will pursue stuff like this just like they would pursue a video game and pour hours and hours of time into it.
So what's your unique ability? What are you the very best at out of all your abilities, and how are you using that in the projects you're working on?
Man, I would love to be the smartest guy in the room, but
you're really good at, are you a great synthesizer? Are you a great, aggregator of talents? I mean, what are you best at, and how is that manifesting in the projects you're working on?
Well, I was just going to say I would love to be the smartest guy, but I end up in some rooms with some really smart people, and that's not a bad thing. I think kind of my thing that I'm able to do is take sometimes something that is a really difficult, complex concept and then translate it and, let people grasp it and see what's going on and be able to talk about it or argue about it or surface some of the issues and the problems. And so that's really great for working on policy, and it's really great for working with investors who need to understand what are they really putting their money into. But it's probably the best and the most rewarding working with kids who are just starting, their trajectory in life and encouraging them to aim really high, because there's just nothing you can't understand. There's nothing you can't get your arms around if you try. And so yeah, that's, if I had a superpower, that's probably it.
Have you thought about trying to bring kids to literally these companies, for a day, for like a focus group session, or, literally to get their input, have the people that run the company, maybe they're trying to get money for funding, and so they literally will do their presentation for kids of various ages. And if the kids can understand it, that's a good signal that investors will understand it. Maybe there's a way to get kids involved literally in some of these discussions and get their input. And it may sound like, how would they know? But maybe, like you said, because they're just so open-minded and creative, they might they might help the process.
That's a really great idea, if for no other reason, because kids will come up with, well, why can't we do it this way? And then that leaves the adults to say, well, this is why we can't, or if they're like, yeah, well, why can't we do it this way? And I think sometimes as a parent explaining something to a child, sometimes they'll, without meaning to talk me into something, they will make me question my own assumptions, because that's what they're doing. That's what kids are born to do, is question the world and learn how to live in it. I love that idea. We haven't done that with really small kids. We've done a couple of programs that I've worked in with various agencies, where we actually bring kids up through like entrepreneurial training, and kids 16 to 18, and American high school aged kids, and say, this is how you identify a problem and how you try to solve it, and some of the things you do. And there have been some really incredible results from that. I've met some incredibly bright, children who are just on the verge of becoming these incredible problem-solving adults who work on things like health or disaster recovery. Some of the companies that have come out of this that rival some of the best companies that I've seen come out of Silicon Valley. The problem is then generally those kids are going off to college to pursue their education to prepare for the real world, and they have to stop working on what they were working on to do that.
Well, I can say, like, my kids are 10, 12, and 14, and I really feel like they're becoming my advisors now. They are getting to that age, I would say probably 12, 13 and up, where they really can contribute, So I know what you mean. Now, maybe very young kids, but I think 13, 18, they really do have a lot to contribute, and they're pretty smart.
It's a sweet spot, right? And, if there were one thing that I could really change about American and then world business culture, it would be, take your kids to work shouldn't be a thing you do 1 year a day and you do special programs. It should be something that we do all the time, because work now fills every corner of our lives. You can't get away from it. You got a supercomputer in your pocket that people can always get a hold of you on, and you got to have some balance. But when you don't, why not involve your kids? Why not get them used to this idea that they can contribute and they can do things? And I've tried to do a certain amount of this early on whenever I was doing stuff with my twins, and I was broken up with my partner. We were kind of having to coordinate like these crazy globe-trotting schedules, and maybe one of us would have both the kids, or one of us would have one and one would have the other while we were traveling around, and then we would swap, and then we would all get together. But I would take kids with me in the boardroom because I didn't have any other, I'm in some strange city and I don't want to go find a babysitter that I trust. And I'm just like, hey guys, do you mind if Trent sits here in colors? And then Trent would be like, I don't know, Daddy, what is epigenetics? or Daddy, right. Why did that motion get passed that way? And if you got polite kids, you can get away with it. If you got kids who kind of know when to shut up. But I think that it's tremendous because kids get to see what you do and they get to contribute to some extent. They get to ask questions. If we did more of that, I think we would have people who are better suited as they grow up for not, to be a peg in a hole in some job, but to really be agile and solve problems. And that's what we need, and it's what we want. It's what we hope for our kids too.
Yeah, I grew up thinking, walking by like a store and thinking, wow, how could someone own a store I had no concept of business, and I don't want that for my kids. I want them to maybe equally think, all right, I can go to college, or I could start a business, or I could, work at a job, or just, it's all equal to them. And it's not scary to do one or the other. It's just another option.
Yeah, exactly. I think even, and this is kind of hard for me to say as a engineer and a scientist, but even more important than the knowledge about it is kind of that attitude. It's like, I could do that. I could give that a shot. And I think exposing them in a way where you're empowering them does exactly that. You give them that confidence, and not a false confidence. It's, it's like, hey, let's try this. And, oh man, that didn't work. Well, okay, what do? We got to pick ourselves up and try something else. And the ability to try a lot of things and work on what's important to you and keep on doing things.
Well, very cool. Well, Raymond, this conversation followed exactly your method. It covered many things, and I think it was good. So what's the best way for people to find out more about you and your work and then any of the initiatives that we spoke about?
Well, as you can probably tell, I love talking about the things I love talking about. So anybody who wants to reach me or learn more about it or ask any questions, find me probably on LinkedIn is the easiest way. And I'm one of the prominent Raymond McCauleys, and so it's not hard to find me there. And go ahead and connect up and contact me.
Very good. Well, Raymond, thanks for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Rich, thanks for having me.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.